But as Don says, it's about unlocking the potential and opportunities for local food production on the peri-urban fringe, which we think is enormous, to be honest. We want a renaissance in market gardens, and we've set up this project called Fringe Farming with a number of partners who are all here today to talk to you about the potential and the barriers that we think can be removed. So we do want to increase the amount of agro-ecological farming at the edges of UK cities. And obviously 50 years ago, they ringed many cities. They provided the fresh produce to the near markets and the most vulnerable produce. And that was absolutely critical at that time. But we've lost a huge amount of capacity. We've lost those farms to urban sprawl, and the land has been sealed with concrete in many cases, but there is still soil and land there for growing food, and we think this should be grabbed as a potential for our food system. And part of the land use framework that's been announced yesterday could be really focusing on the potential for this, because the kind of urban food growing we can do in the urban fringe could be really productive. You can produce a huge amount of fruit and veg on a small area of land, we know that. So we can be delivering the health benefits of fresh produce, perishable produce, closer to the markets, and markets of all income and price points. We're not interested only in high value, high cost produce for wealthy consumers. But there are many other benefits from farming the fringe. One of the things which is sort of an intangible one, but I think, Sir Don, you'd agree, we talk about the connection between rural and urban for decades and needing to be better.
Well, over 20 years.
20 years, absolutely. And that's a way that we see, and in other countries in Europe they're seeing as well, that the blurring the boundary between the urban and rural fringe through growing in those areas could be really valuable for that connection, that connectivity and education, and providing people with understanding of where food comes from on their doorstep, so to speak. So that's sort of blending the urban and rural, but also you've got economic benefits. We will be hearing about some of the jobs and training that can be developed as a result of peri-urban farm businesses, contracts and services, enterprise and produce, adding value. All these kinds of things could come from a huge renaissance in peri-urban food growing. And we're doing a piece of work to identify what that could look like, actually, if we did put peri-urban around every urban conurbation. It could be really huge, as well as the amount of food produced. And there's also the social community development. As I mentioned, education. We're hoping to see an education standard in the new environmental land management scheme in England, similar schemes in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, that could be paying growers to get people on the site to understand where the food comes from, understand how to grow, and learn about agroecological growing. And also community development, real opportunities to involve communities in this insight and get involvement between people, food growers, the land, and obviously skills and training, critical area. We know there's a real issue with skills and training for people into farming. They could provide the gateway to new entrants into farming through peri-urban food growing. And then there's also an untapped, I think, as yet, potential for environmental gains, not just in terms of maintaining the green belt, or as I like to call it, the green wild food belt, which could be achieved through more peri-urban agroecological growing and orchards and things like that. Could also have water management, flood alleviation, enhancing biodiversity. We're talking about agroecological production, so it's very diverse, using the whole canopy and capturing carbon through having more permanent, more perennial crops on the land in ways that other uses of that land, possibly things like the golf course, may not do. Obviously, there's some wild bits on the golf course as well. There's good golf courses out there, but we could be contributing to really good, sustainable, but also good diets, better use of the land, and healthy diets in urban areas and linking people. As we know, there's huge impact of deaths attributed to lower vegetable diets in the UK, as we've got a figure there, 18,000. And we could actually, by just a small amount of land in the peri-urban fringe, be meeting the national fruit and veg demand of 5 a day. which would be really amazing. But actually, there's so many win-wins with this stuff. I want to sort of go quickly. I better go on to the next slide. There's, real win-wins, and we talk about that in our report, which you all had a copy of. We also talk about the career pathways into peri-urban farming, and we've seen that in the schemes that we work with, such as Organically and Sutton and other farms, which are actually providing skills and training for people in the local area to go into horticulture and other forms of farming. And you can have a more diverse new entrants into farming, and get them more, and have people who are more adaptable to the changes we're going to face with climate change and biodiversity issues. So we've got a real potential there to bring more new faces and new diverse faces into farming, people without prior links to farming, by providing the land, the resources, skills, and the markets as well, and developing markets for that produce. And so we'll be really, really helping with the urban renewal and green New Deal, so to speak, green jobs in food and farming. So real potential there for new entrants and training in places near to vast amounts of people who want it. Sorry, last slide is our asks, which is key for members of Parliament to think about. I won't go through them all, but we've got quite a long list in the actual report, and we've summarised them in the briefing that you have in front of you. But key things are actually identifying the land that's available, protecting what we already have, the county farms network and public land that's available for food growing, and put actual resources into mapping that land so that we know what's available. We can actually local communities can talk to people who have the land, so we can actually have some access to that information about who owns the assets, the land assets. And we're talking a lot with the public authorities who have that land, but there are others, other institutions like the NHS, schools and universities that might have land that we could actually put some food growing on with all sorts of benefits. We also want to see planning frameworks protect and encourage agroecological practices on the land and protect the high-grade land, of which there is a large amount, as I said. We're doing research about what's available. So those are just a few of the areas around local authorities and public institutions, what they should be doing. The new entrance idea, the new entrance sports scheme, which is about to be piloted, should really make sure that it looks at horticulture and peri-urban opportunities there, to give entrepreneurship training with council, institutional, private land, startup resources, so they can apply their training. There's huge potential there on those areas. But the key barriers are land, training and finance for new entrants. So this could provide a lot of opportunities there. And through the environmental land management schemes, we want to see any size barriers to entrance to these schemes. And this particularly applies to small-scale horticulture that can be very productive. Why shouldn't it have access to the environmental land management schemes? The barrier still, when the new scheme is launched in this month, I believe, there will still be that barrier, and we are campaigning for it to be removed. And we need to pilot peri-urban horticulture schemes as part of the opportunities in the land management scheme, so pilot for smallholder farmers. But there's a lot more that we talk about, the detail on planning, on training things in the report. But basically land, training and finance are the key things. So the last slide is just why we talk about agroecological, but we should move on probably to the next week, but just gains from doing agroecological, as opposed to, you could argue, very intensive farming or very high-tech vertical farms, which have their place probably, but we think there's a really big role for agroecological soil-based, it could be, glasshouse-based peri-urban farming with cognitive restoration, biodiversity, education and training for local community, natural capital, green spaces, well-being, green spaces that we're learning, potential for reducing chemicals, potential for using waste, integrating it into the growing practices and using local community waste, for instance, and building fertile soils and flood alleviation. But we should move on. That's why we're talking about agroecological.
Yeah, well, thank you, Vicky. That's fascinating and makes a lot of logical sense. So moving on then to second presentation.
I think that's me.
Is that you? That's
Yeah.
okay. Well, can I introduce Gareth Roberts? Who described as a regional partner, Gareth.
That's correct.
And the founder of Regather, which I assume is a demonstration of all of this.
It most certainly
Works in
is.
practice.
Yes, no, that's right, working in practice. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. So yeah, my name's Gareth, and I am a co-founder of a cooperative called Regather, which is based in Sheffield. And yeah, we employ currently around about 24 people, 16 full-time equivalent. We run a fruit and veg box scheme. We serve between sort of 650 and 750 households a week with fresh, seasonal, and as locally grown as possible produce. It's all organic, soil associated, certified. We run a market garden on 15 acres of land on the outskirts of Sheffield, in an area called the Moss Valley, which is just into northeast Derbyshire. And we've been responsible for a whole range of kind of sustainable food system activity in Sheffield for maybe sort of 8-10 years. And you do anything about that? Oh, it's a division bell. Oh, right. It's about stop.
We've also got tech issues with people.
Thanks very much. Sorry about that. I'll be back.
Thank you.
So the opposite of being safe, it's Scotland, but,
Yes.
and it's going to start ringing again in a bit. I can see we've got some online participants arriving. Previously we didn't. Open the wrong Zoom room.
And then it's
Interesting, isn't it?
Apologies to everyone online.
Somebody's played around with the,
Yeah, there's definitely an issue with
There's been an issue with the event, right?
yeah.
oh, really?
Yeah, it's somehow.
It's not syncing up with Zoom, but I want to try and work something out.
After all that effort, I'm sure those people want to hear,
Sure,
but we can share the event, can't we?
Yeah, we're
afterwards?
recording
So
it.
we should probably,
Shall I carry on now? That's the end of the bell.
yes.
Great. Great.
And MPs will arrive back.
Okay, right. I've totally lost my thread. Just getting warmed up. So yeah, we run a box scheme and a market garden. And so what the question that I think Vicky sort of said, and Aria, why am I in farming? And I'd say I'm a social entrepreneur. But then a better question would be, why is a social entrepreneur in farming, and specifically peri-urban or urban horticulture? So as someone who set up a cooperative enterprise, we found our way into food and sustainable food, particularly through quite a sort of a circuitous route. But I suppose the most significant stage of development that I wanted to highlight, because I think it was very significant in terms of how we've evolved as an organisation, was a program called Community Economic Development, which was a DCMS funded program, sort of back to 2015. And that gave great. And that gave us an opportunity to look at what we were doing and assess the best sector in which to do what we were doing. And so the vision of Regather as a cooperative all the way through from the beginning was what we loosely called at the beginning a mutual local economy. So essentially it's an economic proposition. It's always been about entrepreneurship, cooperative entrepreneurship. And so the Community Economic Development Programme gave us a period of time to essentially say, right, are we doing what we want to do here around cooperative enterprise in the most appropriate economic sector? So we looked at a range of pieces of work around foundational economics, really useful kind of reference. And essentially, these are economic sectors that are essential to a well-functioning society. All these sectors have in common dominant monopoly players, wealth extraction, and a degree of kind of multinational, globalized corporate dominance. And whether that's food, with the supermarkets, or energy, or banking, health and social care, housing, they all share similar qualities in terms of economic sectors that, because of those underlying problems, operate in a particular way that reinforce inequality and all the other issues. So as an organisation that was wanting to challenge some of those structural problems, we had to assess whether we were in the right economic sector. Now, a co-op, to move it, let's say we said, oh, let's move into banking, let's start addressing money supply. Obviously, we're going to need vast quantities of capital, and it's very heavily regulated. Let's say we wanted health and social care, similarly, very heavily regulated, big barriers to entry around training and skills. Anyway, food, on the other hand, is a very low barrier to entry sector, and it's very relevant to people, and it is something that's immediately accessible at every level of society, every person, whether they're just eating a meal or whether they are a major agricultural food producer. And so for us, interestingly, we arrived at food, not because, I'm a passionate foodie, but that wasn't really the reason. The reason was that as an economic sector, it offers the best opportunity for a particular way of operating, obviously based on cooperative principles and social enterprise values, that allows for us as a small social business to start making happen certain changes. And ultimately, it was that underlying economic proposition, which is about community wealth building, or what we describe as a mutual local economy. Although when we first came up with that, we had no idea what we were talking about. But as times changed, we evolved, and both also did the sector, and with that came around community wealth building. And for me, that's a much more coherent route into agroecological, peri-urban horticulture, because essentially this is an economic sector, and we aren't talking about a few raised beds at the end of the street, that allow a few lettuces or your fruit bush. There's nothing wrong with that, okay, but we need so much more than just that. And this is why peri-urban agroecological food growing, horticulture, agriculture is absolutely essential to the future of our food system. Now, for us as a box scheme operator based in Sheffield, we had a choice very early on in the development of our business to try and grow everything to then sell it, which is often the model of community supported agriculture, or we could grow our market and use a supply chain to build the customer base. So that's where we were going, as our growth model. So we're working with wholesalers who can bring in the quantity of produce that allows us to service a much larger customer base. Because if you start with no land, then you're going to start with no food to grow and to sell. So we're very much focused on building a customer base. And that's essentially what we did. From around about 2012-ish onwards, Took us about 5 years or so to get to about 300 customers. And then it sort of increased to about 400 pre-COVID. And then we went in a week from about 350 customers to 680. And we used our wholesale supply chain to service those needs and build a business. Now, the reason why we're able to do that is because of the supply chain that's based on a whole range of food growers. We're also able to do that with digital infrastructure. So essentially, we're an online retailer. And we're there selling food into households that they buy on a mobile device or a website, and we deliver that to their homes using as low carbon logistics as possible. So that's electric trike, collection points, but we do have to operate certain diesel vans as well. But that's all about getting shortening the supply chain. So our business model, is to build a customer base, households that want to buy organic and as locally grown produce as possible. So given the situation of very limited access to land, very limited access to finance, and a skills and training infrastructure that doesn't serve the needs of an agricultural, horticultural food grower, we've made it as far as we have in some really poor conditions, right? And essentially, the supermarkets are the dinosaurs here. Right? We're competing in a future where Amazon and Ocado are going to be the dominant players. And so this brings me to the connections. So my background's in cultural policy. So if you'd asked me, what I did 5 years ago, I'd said, well, I'm a cultural entrepreneur. What's that?
Yes.
So I used to work in arts and creative media, and I'd manage artists, manage creative people. And one of the big challenges around about that time was the development of the creative and cultural industries. So around about 97 onwards, there was something called the Creative Industries Task Force, and that was a sector-specific development strategy that was all about the creative and cultural industries. And fast forward a couple of decades, and what you've got now is a world-beating creative sector in the UK economy. We need to do the same thing for agricultural, peri-urban food growth. And it's sector-specific development strategy, huge amounts of investment, because basically the growers and the people who could have jobs in this sector are the artists and the creatives of 15 or 20 years ago. And what we've got to do in the process of that, I think, is avoid some of the pitfalls that we've now seen in the development of creative and digital industries, which is where you end up with dominant players like Uber and Spotify. And if you look at the development of that sector and the digital infrastructure, the disintermediation that all of that enabled, so you end up with platform corporates who own the means of distribution. The same is going to happen with food. It's already starting to happen, but it will continue to happen unless there is a fundamental shift in terms of what government strategy is about, where the investment is, and recognising that the answer doesn't lie with the supermarket-based food system. It lies with a much more creative, technologically driven, and by which I don't mean growing everything in nutrient solutions. I mean growing things in soil, but then have the distribution, the logistics, and the ability to reach customers in ways that currently the supermarkets are trying to do and failing, and the likes of Amazon and Ocado are succeeding, and they're beginning to dominate the marketplace. And so there is this significant opportunity. And for us in Sheffield, we were at the forefront of the development of the cultural industries. So we had the Cultural Industries Quarter, and we had initiatives like the Workstation, the Showroom, and AVEC, and that supported like the likes of Depeche Mode and the Arctic Monkeys and big world-beating cultural products, right? We've got a similar opportunity with the land infrastructure, the training, the skills, they all need developing. So anyway, I've crammed way more than possibly in 5 minutes, and that's probably a lot more than 5 minutes as well. I used to lecture for a living, so, so I can talk for a few hours without even.
Well, thank you, Gareth. And can I apologise to those on the line if you had a problem with connectivity? We are now into this interesting process. This is a seminar, and I hope you heard most of Gareth's presentation, which has been fascinating. And I have loads of questions, so I'm sure those who are listening to this will also have lots of questions. Please, can you keep those questions until we've completed our next presentation? And when you do so, put your hand up and we'll try and identify who asked questions. So our next presentation is from Dan Lark. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
And Dan is the owner of Gleveland's Organic Produce. So Dan, you're going to tell us all about your venture as well there.
I will.
Perhaps
Yes.
not quite as long as Gareth.
No, I'm not a lecturer like that, so not quite as wordy, so we'll be a little bit briefer. Yeah, my name's Dan. I run Gleveland's Organic Produce, which is based in South Manchester. It's a business that I took on at the start of last year. It's basically just short 3 acre market garden, and we sell mostly salads, pots to local greengrocers, veg box schemes, and wholesalers. We're also Soil Association certified. Got into it a few years ago. I used to work in live music and events, which I was getting very tired of, spending a lot of time away from home. I sort of started doing bits of volunteering work. I knew that sort of growing and being involved in a sustainable food system was something I was interested in and wanted to be more involved with. On what level at that point I didn't know. So I started doing bits of volunteering, and then I did a farm start programme, which is also based in South Manchester, which was it was very eye-opening. It was a good introduction to what is involved in growing and that sort of thing. But it's one of those things. It's grossly underfunded, and I feel needs some more backing to make it something that it really needs to be in order to bring more people, be more available to more people. And then after that, I did some more sort of a bit more serious volunteering. Did some stuff over in Sheffield, not with Regather, but with Sheffield Organic Growers, some work with Nick over there. And I did another couple of weeks at a place down near Cambridge. And then I got my first full-time job in market gardening at what was then Cleveland City Growers, which was at the start of the year that COVID first hit, so March 2020. I was supposed to be doing little bits of live music and events work around that, and obviously that all literally disappeared overnight. Nobody in the industry worked for 18 months. Well, in some ways, kind of landed on the feet that I actually had some work, you know. And during that year, the people that ran it previously basically decided that they were selling up and moving on. So I had the opportunity to buy into the business, which I did. I've been very, very lucky financially. My previous job, I don't have any children at the moment, so my dad saved a lot of money. He's passed away now. When he passed away, he left us some money. And so, sort of financially, I've been very lucky, and I've been able to afford to buy the business. But obviously, a lot of people don't have that advantage. And obviously, having a excuse me, that's my train of thought now. having a business that's already established, there's a customer base there, there's land there, there's already the systems in place, what works well, growing, that sort of thing. So I was quite lucky in that respect to have all those things already there. But obviously, most people coming into this business don't have that, you know, which is where I think good training programs would be invaluable, you know. Obviously, acquiring land for most people, I think, is a very difficult thing. I have been thinking about expanding the business. I would like to be able to reach more people with what we do, thinking about going down the veg box route at some point. At the moment, we don't do that. But acquiring land is a very difficult thing, and a lot of people that I've spoken to that we've had through the business as volunteers helping out that are, you know, on a similar journey have all said that, you know, the problem of finding land is really, really hard. And I think from a personal point of view as well, something I've sort of struggled, it wasn't about the COVID year. I had an awful lot of people applying for work, but finding staff this year has been really tricky for us. I think that's something that's needs to be addressed. And again, coming back to the training, you know, I think having more accessible training programs is an invaluable thing for businesses like us. And yeah, I think that's as much as I'd like to say for now.
Well, thank you, Dan. So quite a contrast, if I might take the liberty of asking the first question. Contrast between the two models. You mentioned that entry, because of the price of land, is quite high, and yet Gareth said entry district market was quite low. So we've got two very contrasting statements about how to get in there. If you do have to purchase a few acres of land, then talking about a lot of capital to do that. So Gareth, just a couple of questions from me. Firstly, the co-op, is the co-op among your customers, or is it your growers that are members of the co-op?
So we're a community benefit society, if you look under the bonnet. Yeah. So we have primarily our workers are the members, but we do have customers who are members as well. So we don't have different classes of membership. We're a single class membership.
And you made the statement, barriers to entry are low. So explain that. Sure.
So the food sector as a whole, you can start up a food business of any particular sort relatively easily. Obviously, at the moment you go into food production or needing land to operate, those barriers to entry go up. But to operate a box scheme, you don't need land to start with. So you can build a customer base, providing you're able to retail produce and you have a supply chain to buy those in. So
someone who's growing that for you.
Yeah. So our business model is essentially to replace what we currently buy from outside of Sheffield, if you like, with produce that we grow within Sheffield. That's very simplified, massively oversimplified. But we could do that for the next 10 years, and we still wouldn't replace all of the produce that we currently sell to our existing customer base. Never mind the possibility of growing.
So first of all, any questions around the table to or indeed to Vicky?
Well, Gareth, how did you get hold of your land, and who was sort of, were you the initiator, promoter of the whole project, or was a local authority involved? How did it all get going?
Sure. So the local authority wasn't involved. Answer that one straight off. I'll not go into all the detail because it goes back about 10 years, maybe even a bit longer. But essentially, it starts with a community-supported agriculture initiative. That was born out of something called the Making Local Food Work programme. So this is a multi-year, multi-million-pound programme of capacity building, essentially, for the local food sector. Lottery funding, yeah. Which was absolutely instrumental in bringing a group of people together who then got in touch with a local farmer who was dairy, was now arable, didn't have a succession plan. This is in the Moss Valley, northeast Derbyshire, and principally it was about relationship building with that farmer. And the thing that really opened the door was an oral history project that was done on the back of a small grant that enabled members of our group to get to know the local farming community, understand some of the challenges that they were facing in terms of their future and how they operate. And then that built a relationship of trust that ultimately led to a small parcel of land being sold to essentially a property developer who is also a Quaker. So they acquired a 15-acre parcel of land. On the back of that development, another parcel of land was secured from the same farmer as the landowner. That was purchased by a different social enterprise, and it is currently now that social enterprise that leases the land to Regather Cooperative on a 20-year farm business tenancy agreement. And that took a long time. And we had to raise the finance ourselves, we had to borrow, and obviously build a revenue-funded business that enabled us to service those debts. And the business case for the land was our box scheme. Without the box scheme, we wouldn't be able to consider the land. So we sort of put customer growth first.
Yes, and that was
Invest
my
in
next
you.
question.
Yeah, so
What security did that?
well, it's the Real Farming Trust enabled us to, obviously we didn't buy the land, we rent it. Yeah. Okay, and it took also a really shrewd rural land agent working with us, because the landowner is a social enterprise, and so we've got a bespoke farm business tenancy agreement that sort of short circuits some of the particular qualities of a typical FBT, which is around compensation. So we are currently in a very low rent tenancy agreement, but in return we've basically foregone the ability to be compensated by the landowner at the end of our tenancy, because that's a race to the top.
No, I can't read from here. We've got questions.
There are no questions in the Q&A, and we do have Mark Driver in the chat that says we need to identify on who owns all of the land in the UK, including Crown, Church and University. We've also had a comment about the microphone, so if you speak up, I think they're struggling to hear. If you scroll up, Ari, I think there might have been another one, but yeah, that was it. But yeah, they'll trickle in.
Okay, that's fine. Any more questions around the table?
I was asked to do a 5-minute.
Yeah, no, we'll come back to that, yes. We're holding that in reserve here.
Steph,
Can I just very quickly share my experiences around the land access in Bristol? So we're one of the partners
Yes.
as well, and just say
Would you like
that.
to pull your chair in, because the camera may not see you from there.
I mean, just really quickly say that the council in Bristol own a lot of land, but they don't know really what it is and they don't manage it well. And the point about the grade 1 agricultural land and protecting that, we have a strip of grade 1 agricultural land, which was like the market gardening quarter that fed the whole city. And it's been so infringed upon, building, sports pitches on it, and it's constantly, the agricultural land that is left is a constant threat of park and rides, that kind of stuff. There's no protection over it. And I just want to say that I think that's really important, because that fed the city, and the stuff that the agriculture that's currently on that land is not, it should be market gardening, but it's not. It's the land's so badly managed, it's people growing field beans.
Sorry, I should have introduced your whole partners here. Steph from Bristol and B from Land Workers Alliance, who runs the Practitioners Forum project, and Mark from Shared Assets, working with us on that event.
Can I just make a comment on the length of time it takes to get hold of the land? Because
Yes,
this is a
indeed.
very typical story that Gareth has related in lots of different places, and it's taking on average sort of 10, sometimes longer years to get these projects up and running, which means that at the moment the capacity to actually feed cities is really small, but we need to actually speed this up if we're actually to scale up to meet the capacity that we believe that this sector has.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and which Vicky mentioned, protecting grade 1, grade 2 land. I mean, that's a massive challenge because a lot of cities are sitting on land which is grade 1, grade 2, and the obvious expansion of housing infrastructure as well as that. So we have a number of MPs and peers sitting around the table who've agreed, I think, arms been twisted, to give us a few minutes each. So Daniel, I think, is first. So can I introduce Dan? Can you introduce yourself, Daniel, and then just give us your wisdom on this whole
Very good. Thank you very much. Daniel Irish, Member of Parliament for Cambridge, and Labour's Shadow Food, Farming, Fishing and Rural Affairs Minister. This has been an interesting week in terms of. So just a couple of observations. I mean, while we were out voting, I was quite struck. We went from peri-urban farming to cultural entrepreneurship.
We did.
Brilliant. It reminded me of a time I told a very grand columnist from the Eastern Daily Press, this is the mid-90s, I was a social entrepreneur. I think he was so terrified, he thought I was a socialist entrepreneur, and he fled to France. But there's no whole point there, because the mix of things that you are doing and describing are actually pretty familiar to me, because we have a fantastic project in and around Cambridge called Co-Farm, which I don't know whether that was what you were referring to. But it's been a fantastic success. I have to say it's helped by having some big institutions who are happy to look benevolent in a city like Cambridge and put money in. So that's part of the answer is how you get, and also supported farming and so on. But the link from that to the local food hubs that were established by the City Council during the pandemic has really transformed the local food situation. And seeing the number of people involved and the effect it's had on their lives and their mental health has really been truly inspiring. So in a way, certainly with me, you're pushing an open door a lot of this. Well, I would just say in terms of the broad picture, this last week has been, I think, possibly a touch disappointing for people who've been working on these issues for many, many years. I think it's quite hard to discern exactly what the government's food policy is. It sometimes happens. Sorry about this, Derek, but when the Prime Minister gets involved, it gets even more complicated because quite a lot of things that have been said this week seem to be thoroughly contradictory. And over time, probably we will begin to discern some of it. But out of the wreckage, I think there are some things actually which are quite positive. And I think the promise on a national land use framework is something that certainly the opposition, Jim McMahon's had a Secretary of State been talking about partly over the last few months, very much influenced by one or two people in the other place. And of course, it absolutely goes to the heart of the system, what we're using our land for. And there's a long way to govern it. It's one thing to say it's going to happen, another thing to bring it into reality. And I think the truth is that within this parliamentary term, I doubt whether we're going to see very much progress. But it's a good marker, and certainly the opposition will be pursuing it. I think it will be one of our big flagships as we go into a general election, hopefully at one point into government. So I say you're pushing on an open door. The 5 hectare issue, I think, is a really important one. Majority of land workers have been bending my ear on this and others for a long, long time. And I was pretty astonished when people told me the number of farm enterprises, or that's the definition of a farm is quite interesting these days, down in the southwest that fell out with this slightly artificial level. And I think it's huge amounts that can be done, and probably for not huge amounts of money, quite frankly. So the whole question of whether we're supporting farmers, what we're supporting them to do, I think is up for discussion. And I think that's a positive to come out from this week. But as I say, in terms of the report that you've done today, thank you, it's extremely helpful. And I think we'll be looking to what we can learn from the examples that people have already got through all these hurdles so far, whether we can make it much easier for people in other places. And that's the key.
Indeed. Well, thank you. It always, I suppose, frustrates, actually irritates me when I go on the train to Cambridge and I see some grade 2 land being covered in solar panels. Is this good use of this land?
Well, the problem is, for farmers at the moment, they're telling me they're being inundated with offers which looks like a much better return for doing that than for growing food. And that is a fundamental.
It is. Derek can
Thank
you
you, sir.
introduce yourself?
Derek Thomas, I'm
Over to
MP,
you.
I'm MP for St Ives, West Cornwall and the Isle of Scilly. So interestingly, pretty much everywhere I look is growing something or not. And what I really enjoyed this afternoon, because it feels a bit like marriage counselling. Because what we reckon, I'm sure Daniel, you'd agree with this. Daniel and I bizarrely, we bump into each other all the time during the course of I work here. But the last few years, I would say 3 or 4 years, there's been a real tension about growing food and caring for the environment. And it's not been a happy relationship at all. And in my constituency, you've got farmers who really feel discouraged and feel they're going to give up because they just feel they're always being criticised for what they do. And then you've got people on the other side of it actually desperately recognising we need food, but we also need to create biodiversity, etc. What I hear today is that you can bring those two together and quite successfully. So I really enjoyed your presentation. All the others try and listen to yours. So I'll be really brief. I know it's 5 minutes. So I won years and years ago. I won an award for setting up a project. I ran an organisation for people with learning disabilities. I wanted some, I hate the word meaningful, I wanted meaningful things for them to do rather than, well, there are some other examples of where we just park them up.
It was that before you became an MP.
Oh yeah, meaningful, yeah. Good job I know. So we went to the National Trust, we got hold of an old walled garden for a big estate, Penrose in Huston, and they gave us a walled garden and we did vegetable and fruit there. Tried pineapples, but they used to be there, but we didn't see it. And then we delivered those using also local producers, mainly with vegetables that the supermarkets have rejected, to distribute them around very local area. And so we won an award for the food miles, but also the way we were supporting people in that industry. And what I see, having worked with my farmers about the worry about fresh produce industry, worry about whether we can actually produce the food we need, worry about the loss of land. What I hear all the time is we need to find ways of bringing sparking interest in schools and in young people, in their families, about why it's important to produce the food that we need. And we absolutely should. If the food strategy has not gone from that piece, we should absolutely supercharge food production the way we're supercharging energy production. And it's the only response. We can do it in an environment friendly way. So this helps with that. And I think if we could really grapple with this, sort out the land ownership, the finance, the incentives to do it, the skills which I think aren't just the skills for this, but also the skills that would then populate the whole of the sector. We really will get to a place where this country won't wrestle so much again with how we produce food. I mean, in the past we've done it. After the Second World War, we managed to produce normal tons of food. So I'm really encouraged by today. I think the health and well-being, the mental health amongst lots of people. And Cornwall is a great example of, obviously, if you can get into Cornwall, it's quite a busy place. If you do get into Cornwall, you'll see really good examples of this, of where we're already doing some of this. There's an organisation that was called TEACH, Plants, Eat and Teach. It supported particularly people with mental health issues. It's now developed in growing links, so the food they produce and the food they get from elsewhere, they use to provide fresh food for food banks. So it's some brilliant work, and I think if we could upscale it in the way you're proposing and really create that commitment to that you've described, we would do the whole country a great service, and also those around the world that otherwise we're eating the food that they need.
Well, thank you, Derek. Lord Cameron, you.
Yeah, thanks.
You're just feeling a bit uncomfortable here because of this land use commitment, didn't they? Good strategy, because he sits in the hot seat.
Yeah. And actually, what I'm going to say follows very much on what Derek says, who I incidentally also come from Cornwall. Because I just want to take a step back, because there are many rural land outputs, and it's not a good idea in my mind to exclusively focus on one at the cost of any other, as we have done for instance the last 50, 60, 70 years. We focused on cheap food at the cost of our biodiversity. Everyone knows the stats, I won't go there. Or for that matter, as some people have a division, focus on rewilding the exclusion of food production, which I think post-Ukraine is probably not quite so popular as it might have been. Applies to peri-urban land, which, I mean, as both Vicky and Steph were saying, is is most of our market towns were built where they are because that was the best land. So most of the peri-urban land was pretty good land. And in terms of outputs, obviously there are particular food, which you pretty well dealt with, biodiversity, which is obvious, flood prevention, SUBs, etc. Health, access, and sports that was mentioned, Derek mentioned just now. Education and community gains that Vicky was mentioning earlier on. Carbon capture and storage in trees. I mean, trees have a really important role. Hopefully the trees will be grown, capture the carbon and then get put into houses rather than being burned as logs, whatever, so that that carbon remains for 300 years, we hope, into furniture, let's say. But also, I mean, it's quite interesting that CEH, which I happen to chair, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, we were asked by the Welsh Government, what is the best use of land that isn't being grown for food, because they expected post-Brexit there will be a lot of land. And by far the best cost benefit of land is trees grown next to towns because it cleans the air. The PM 2.5 particles get removed by trees. So in terms of health gain, that's huge. So trees are really, really important. There's obviously energy is another use of land. I mean, we've obviously already decided that solar panels should definitely not go on Grade 1 land or around towns. But there are obviously windmills, and you take Swaffham in Norfolk. They decided they wanted the biggest windmill in the country, which is now no longer the biggest windmill in the country by a long way. But they built it on the edge of their town, and they sold electricity into the town. And they liked it so much, they had a museum, they spiral staircases up and all sorts of stuff. But they built it, and I had nothing against windmills. I think they're actually pretty magnificent. But you can also now get hedges that create electricity with sort of spirals. So they're not big and exclusive and don't let the landscape. So I think they are quite noisy. But some people say just like there's jangle bells in sort of far eastern doorways, and probably just little tingling. Anyway, but the whole point about energy, which actually echoes the thing about food being grown locally, is that if you produce energy, renewable energy on your farm and you sell it into the grid, you get 4 or 5p per kilowatt hour. The grid then sells it back to the customer about 28p per kilowatt hour. But if you can create a local grid, like a food box scheme, then you can sell electricity at say 12, 13, 14%. So you as a landowner or organizer are making twice as much money, and the customer is getting it at half price, which is pretty good. So energy is quite important peri-urban fringe, it seems to me. And then, of course, the last output from land is livelihoods, which definitely must not be forgotten. So the question is, how do you manage all those opportunities in a positive way? And some outputs obviously clash. Farmers producing food next to towns used to complain to me in a big way, they get their fruit and veg stolen, potatoes included. But actually, and then screaming children and cats and dogs being walked are not particularly conducive to flourishing wildlife and biodiversity. However, it seems to me that people and food can be dealt with by creating your allotment type syndicate, which needn't necessarily be allotments of lots of small units. It can be like you growing land within a syndicate or allotment syndicate and selling it as, because there's always someone on an allotment. And if someone comes along to pinch your vegetables, you can tell them to bugger off. and that's very important. And meanwhile, people and wildlife problems can be dealt with by good land management. And yet the RSPB reserves, for instance, have lots of public access, but you just have the footpaths going here, there, the dogs and the people go there. But actually over here, people don't even know you've probably got the best ground-nested bird sites in the country, and you can manage that. But of course, it's the overall management of the peri-urban areas that is a problem and needs leadership. And this is where we kind of come back to some thinking within our committee. So our thinking is incredibly embryonic and no one knows where it's going. But very often within the peri-urban fringe, it seems to me there are multiplicity of owners who are all pulling in different directions. You know, horticulture, allotments, trying to farm, development home value, I'm not going to do anything with it, etc. I'm going to wait for it. And so it seems to me that it's the local authority. I think it has to be local. I know you've got the lottery, which is great, but that's not going to happen very often for many people. The local authority can provide the leadership and pay, in my view, for a land use enabler. I don't know if anybody's been involved in housing, but you have quite a lot local authorities have got these housing enablers who go to villages and sort of work out how they're going to create housing for locals. It's a really, really good scheme. I think if you had a land use in it, that we could demonstrate the possible advantages and profits to be made from a coordinated plan, which in order to ensure that we and also, and I think this is, you wouldn't make certain that even though some people might get one hope value, you can say, well, actually, you've got to surrender your hope value. There's going to be no, I come from a local authority, there is going to be no development here, unless the development, we can possibly grant a couple of houses to create the money, to create the funding, to invest in projects, which might be electricity, it might be food, it might be a box in a warehouse, or whatever it might be. So I mean, it's in essence for the overall community project. I think the local authorities have got to show leadership in. I mean, that's just my initial thinking. And it's not the thinking of the committee, Donald Birchman.
That might be one or two signals, isn't it? I mean, Vicky touched on the network of county farms. This is a matter of constant concern. I mean, how many times have we reviewed the future of the county farm? But what Ewan was saying should apply to the county farm structure as well, because the potential benefit from the land ownership that many local authorities have has not been materialised, has not been realised. There's much more there than these local authorities have explored, in my view, to date. And there is a challenge there that needs to be taken. So moving on, and thank you, Ewan. Moving on, Larry, to you, Paul Whitty.
Well, thanks,
incidentally, I was amused when I read the food strategy released yesterday, which is saying we need to do something about public sector procurement. For how many weeks did Larry and I spend trying to encourage public sector?
Nothing new out of this. I'm looking forward to your committee report, because land use is clearly second. I apologise for coming late to the committee, so I haven't heard everything. I was attracted to this subject, but I was thinking of it very much as the periphery of large cities. You've got Manchester and Sheffield as an example that I focus on London, if only because had my ancestors not been tenant farmers and had actually owned the land, I would have inherited a significant portion of very good agricultural land in North East Middlesex, right in the middle of Boris Johnson's constituency. But regrettably, economic forces intervene. My grandfather used to take the vegetables and the poultry and the cat and the rabbits to Shepherd's Bush Market every other day. And all of that good, very good agricultural land in North East Middlesex is now built, pretty much. I think there are 20 farms in something like that in the GLC area. Some of them quite large and conventional farms. But could we change the Fringe in the way that you're putting a relatively small farm? You run up against, I'm going to put the negatives in the second, but I think they're all solvable. You run up against the price of land, you run up against the pressures of land, and you run up, in a sense, on the local authorities not being prepared to prioritise that, because the local authorities, if I take London, you're either talking about the Fringe GLC areas, or you're talking about Hertfordshire and Surrey and so forth, which are effectively also private suburbs with the same pressures on that. I think there is a role for the national planning policy to actually say to local authorities who are in this area, close to large populations, that they ought to be designating land for agricultural and horticultural use. Maybe through county farms or something similar to that in their own land, but more generally as well, they ought to have at least a proportion of that land made available for food. Now, I'm talking primarily about food now. I think one of the problems of the current post-CAP position is that it's freed us from a lot of things getting out of CAP, but we're now pursuing, instead of pursuing the more environmentally and sustainable way of producing food, we're looking at land to do something different. So that no longer be food, but be forestry or rewilding or whatever, which has its place. But actually, a big part of the policy ought to be looking at how we can use our land more effectively for sustainable and small scale, relatively small scale use. Now, first of all, planning policy, I think the National Planning Plan has to say and to lean on local authorities to do it, because they will not do it. The pressures on their land are too great. They will not do it on their own for the most part. It's different in rural areas where there's a bigger political advantage in so doing, but in the quasi-suburban areas, there isn't. And I think it needs to change. Secondly, is the price of land. And in a sense, this speaks, the third point is the possible the structure of the food industry and the possible use of any policy we bring in for greenwashing. We were talking in the Lords yesterday about land being bought up by large companies in effect to provide offsets for what is their extremely damaging carbon emissions elsewhere. The net effect of which on carbon emissions is nil. Whereas actually, if that land could be used by somebody who is engaged in sustainable farming of some sort, it could actually provide a benefit not only to our food policy, but also to our carbon policy. But that does require quite heavy intervention into the land market by somebody. Probably, again, it has to be central government, because local authorities aren't strong enough to do it. And the third issue is the structure of the food chain. Yes, it is changing, but the reality is between the farmers and the consumers, and you can get some sort of farm shop immediate sales, but in general, between the farmers and the consumers are extremely big companies. Wholesalers, processors, retailers, these days, digitally based, deliverers like Ocado, and the big caterers. And unless they are party to this, then it will not work. You can sell, it will not work on a large scale. It might work locally, but it will not work on a large scale. And one of the problems is we never address that. We talk a lot about regulation on farming and changing of agricultural policy. We talk a lot about consumers and better diets and all of that. But in between, there are probably in each of those sectors 4 or 5 companies that dominate it. And yet we don't lean on them enough. And in this fact, in this area as well as others, if we could get 2 or 3 of the oligopolies that control the retail business or the processing business to actually change their size and cultivate small scale provision, then we're not going to get anywhere unless we do that. That's my slightly random thoughts, Tom.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And finally, Jenny.
Thank you.
So, Jenny, you need to introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Jenny Rathbone. I'm the Welsh Labour member for Cardiff Central in the Welsh Parliament, the Senate. And I'm very pleased to be here today. Mine's the only constituency that doesn't have a farm, but I haven't let that get in the way. I've been banging on about vegetables since I was elected in 2011. I started by brandishing a broccoli in the chamber, whether that be allowed in the House of Commons, but to really try and bang home the point that we need to use more agricultural land for vegetable production. At the moment, we only use it 0.1% of our land is dedicated to veg and fruit production, which is a major food security issue. I used to chair the EU programme monitoring committee in 2013 to 2015. So I did actually visit a lot of really wonderful projects funded by something called LEADER, which was part of the Rural Development Programme. And some of them were in unbelievably poor areas like North Gough, which is a former mining town between the Rhondda and the Ogmore valleys. Fantastic projects, very poor land, but really important for people's mental health as well as their diet. And then there were other leader projects that were on sort of peri-urban housing estates in the Vale of Glamorgan, including, some people who built on 2 unwanted tennis courts in a village, and they were selling everything that they could grow into the local restaurants and pubs. So you could tell that there was a real possibility of making proper businesses out of all this, but for whatever reason, these successful initiatives were never mainstreamed by the Welsh Government into every other housing estate, similar to the ones that had demonstrated you could do this. So, and then we have an organisation called Food Sense Wales, which is also known as Food Cardiff, I don't quite know the difference, but who are linked to Sustain. They've now partnered with you. And a couple of years ago, they piloted a demonstration project to show that very small sums of money could be used to accelerate the growth of horticultural businesses. So Dr. Amber Wheeler did the evaluation of these 5 food enterprises with no more than 5 hectares of production land, awarded grants of between 2,500 to 5,000. They increased their horticulture production and also people's local veg consumption. So it led to an average 75% growth in sales and an extra 79 families a week benefited from the food box. So this was a really clear example of what could be done with relatively small amounts of capital. So 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, I was hoping the Welsh Government would grasp this nettle, because the COVID really did demonstrate that there were some huge insecurities in our food networks, and not least, the milk that was poured down the drain because the distributors never came to collect it from West London, etc. But at the time, it was desperate. They just didn't want to know, even though we're talking really quite small sums of money. It all fell on deaf ears. And then 2 years later, suddenly it's like Christmas has come over. So we've got horticulture development grant scheme, 1.5 million for capital grants to expand existing businesses, and even more importantly, a horticulture startup for new entrants into horticulture. So this is really, really exciting. And as Amber Wheeler said on Farming Today last week, at the moment we only use 1 in 1,000 of our fields for horticulture production, and it should be 1 in 50 if we are going to be serious about the amount of veg that we need to produce. So I was really interested in your statistic about the 18,000 deaths from no veg diets, and I can think of all my constituents who fit into that category, who are in danger, if not dying of it, but dying early as a result of their very, very poor diets. And I think, just following up on Paul Whitty and the description of what's going on in England, I think that the ELMS project post Brexit, it really is based on the assumption that food is going to continue to arrive from abroad. That simply isn't going to happen, guys, because it's a combination of Brexit and crashing out of the single market and the climate emergency, which requires us to reduce our food miles as well as our transport mile carbon emissions and our buildings emissions. So we really do have to radically change the way we do things, and we haven't got time on our side. So, for example, the Welsh Government's now investing £200 million in rolling out universal free school meals to all our primary schools. And I chair the cross-party group on school food, so I know how complicated this is. And we definitely have aspirations to source our food locally to feed our children fresh food. But there are some really serious challenges at the moment around. We have got some excellent local distributors who are not multinational companies. So 2 Welsh companies, Castle Howell and Harlech Foods, serving South and West and North Wales, who are really focused on trying to increase the amount of locally produced food that they can sell to the local authorities for the schools. But at the moment, certainly the Harlech Foods says we just cannot find a producer who's productive enough because they're not, it's too small scale, they just haven't got it in terms of what you can, how you can use technology to make a more cost-effective offer. So there's quite a lot of challenge there on that, but I think that isn't the only food security issue we face. I mean, I think the cost of living crisis this winter is going to be really desperate. We have at least 1/3 of our parents who are sticking the meal to try and feed their children. And so, and you know, also the heating crisis. So, staying positive, the work done by Food Cardiff, there's 30 to 40 growing groups around Cardiff, and some of which are supplying food pantries, which are, if you like, the more dignified version of food loans. So everybody joins a club and pays a small sum of money and gets a great deal more value back in the weekly baskets they get. And Food Cardiff is also working with a wholesaler and a peri-urban horticulture business to pilot the route to market through the Universal Free School Meals rollout. This is in Cardiff, so I can't speak about anything else, but and also they're going to be working with Cardiff Council and other landowners to map the potential food growing spaces in the city, because I absolutely get what other people have said, that we just, the local authorities do not pay attention to what land they have or what land they can get hold of through other public bodies. So there's a huge floodplain between Cardiff and Newport, which is accessible by bicycle by probably 500,000 people between the two cities. It's definitely not suitable for housing, but that's not what the current landowners think. They presumably are sitting on it because they think they're going to make a killing on some housing. And so we have to really get real on this land use planning and say you are never going to be allowed to build on a floodplain. We've learned that lesson, and we're going to use it for something useful. So that opportunity would be there, both in giving jobs to young people who are definitely going to be displaced out of industries that aren't going to make it this winter, and you know, they can arrive by bicycle to the job. And there are people who would be happy to help train people up, but we shouldn't be under any illusion. It's hard work, isn't it, being a horticulturist? So there are lots of challenges around really making the foundation economy work for Wales. And of course, we have our wonderful Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and this is in the NFU Cymru's proposals for shaping Wales as farming future. So they've got it too. So actually, there are allies within the NFU I've been working with for at least 8 or 9 years.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Have we got comments or questions online that we might want to consider?
There one question from Jenny. Can Darren earn a
normally, that was obviously a bit of a juggling act getting that right, and it's not going to be really till the end of the year that I'll know whether I have or not. I know I've been gone up quite a lot more than I have. But in order for us to, because we're trying to produce food and sell it at a cost that most people can afford, there's obviously a juggling act between, you know, raising your prices so much and, you know, your stuff not being able to be sold. People aren't going to buy it because they can't afford it, you know. So I am sort of, you know, trying to think of other ways in which we could, you know, make a little bit more money out of it. And listening to Gareth, sorry, was saying about the box scheme and how they started from a box scheme and then went into the market garden. And I've kind of done it the other way around in a way, you know. And it sounds like you've started off with something that almost a little bit, I mean, I don't know how difficult it was at the start, but I mean, I'm sort of thinking about going the other way is what I'm trying to say, and looking at doing some more direct sales. Because by doing direct sales, you can essentially sell stuff for a little bit more, and the customers are getting things for a little bit less than they perhaps would do if they bought from a shop. You know, so the box scheme really is something that I am considering to, you know, sort of bolster the business a little bit and keep it more viable.
Yeah, and growing the food is only one element. I mean, which you've got to market. That's really important. I mean, for local food production, it costs you as much on the market as you do on growing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to do that. And technology plays a key role in making that happen nowadays.
Real opportunity now, direct sales.
Yes, Jenny.
There's something I just wanted to add, which is relevant for us politicians, which is most people have access to a garden and they don't necessarily use it for anything other than dumping some rubbish or whatever. And certainly it's something I've tried to persuade my constituents is to grow food, particularly during the pandemic. There was quite a big reception to that, but we clearly need support. We need, ideally, we need community gardens where people can grow together and swap ideas. This won't solve the problem of how we feed our schools, but it will help with mental health and also increase their diet at a time when they can't actually afford to buy it.
Sorry, yes.
I had a few points to make.
Yes, please.
Yes, so I'm Rebecca Lawson and I work for Land Workers Alliance running their horticulture campaign. And just following on from the people growing in their gardens, which I think is a really, really important point to be making, because I also really wanted to clarify that peri-urban farming is very not allotments, certificates of allotments, which are about subsistence, which is really important, but we are talking about commercial horticulture here. And although there may be volunteers, it's producing something that can be sold to feed people, and we're really keen to be scaling that up. But it's very much part of a system of feeding cities, rather than thinking that peri-urban farms are going to produce all the food for cities. It's feeding cities in conjunction with rural farms and also national wholesalers, as in Gareth's model illustrating. I just wanted to explain, one of the things Land Workers Alliance has been doing is running an elms test and trial focusing on horticulture. And we've been really keen to focus on the opportunities for peri-urban horticulture and all the public goods that they can deliver. So we've been working actually with Sheffield and the peri-urban farms around Sheffield and with London in the first phase of the scheme, and we're hoping to work with Bristol if it gets extended this summer. We also work with the Edible Horticulture Roundtable, which involves quite a lot of larger scale growers. And having been sitting on the Edible Horticulture Roundtable for the last 4 years, I'm struck time and time again by the precarity of the mainstream horticulture sector. And I mean, labour is the thing that is talked about again and again and again, and the fact that British people don't want to work in horticulture. But the peri-urban sector absolutely lies in the face of that. It's attracting so many new entrants. And I mean, just from the example of Dan and Gareth, their career changes. Lots of people come into horticulture through volunteering and mainly peri-urban horticulture. They then go on to do some sort of training course and then they go on to get jobs. And this is a pathway that we see again and again and again. And it could be really expanded quite quickly if there were more training opportunities. And I think peri-urban has a fantastic role to play in that. And then the final thing I wanted to say was about the health benefits, picking up on the point that Mr. Thomas raised about the mental and physical health benefits. I'm as disappointed as everyone else about the lack of content in yesterday's government's food strategy, but the 2 points that I think are real opportunities are the fact that they're going to put 270 million into this innovation fund, and also that they want to have a national horticulture strategy. And I think this is an opportunity we just mustn't miss. And particularly with the innovation funds, I fear there's a lot of it might go towards biotech, automation and so forth. But I think that peri-urban farming ought to be seen as a form of innovation. Innovation isn't just about scientific, technical innovation. It's about looking at the divisions between the consumers and the producers and merging those and bringing people who consume veg into production through volunteering, through public engagement. And I think that if we could get a chunk of that funding to compare areas where there are really well invested in peri-urban schemes and look at the health outcomes and compare them with places where there isn't any peri-urban farming, that would provide some really valuable evidence, which could in future really save money to the health service. So,
thank you very much. It's really helpful. Anything else online that we need to consider?
Just a couple of comments from Mark Driver. It would be great to see apples, pears and plum trees being grown as natural breaks between cities and towns, but accessible to the local community. And he's made another comment about, can we also now ensure that our future schools have sufficient land they can grow enough fresh produce for the school to be sustainable? The process would really underpin education and social well-being. Some more comments rather than questions.
I mean, on this issue of schools, and this applies to very urban farming, I've always felt that landowners could be slightly more innovative in offering schools, nearby schools, a little patch of land. If they haven't got the room for their own school gardens or school farm, they could have a quarter of an acre to play with as part of their own school education. I think we could do a lot more in that area. And the same applies to landowners in the fringes of cities. It's potentially a way of contributing to the social benefits of the city or the town.
It'd be interesting to see if we could do that for farming, for growers as well, schools, but also growers. Accessing a small amount of
quarter of an acre, half an acre is not a huge amount of land for a landowner to offer for in return for the social benefits. Conscious that our time is almost up, and some final comments from you, and then I'll just wind up.
Well, thank you to everybody who's come. Firstly, and for Kerry for booking the room, which was very kind of her. Disappear to another meeting, but thank you very much for chairing. I think it's been a really fascinating meeting and very rich comment from everybody. I really appreciate that, notwithstanding our difficulties with IT. We'll share it, I hope everybody's okay with that, and make some notes of the event. But I think for me, there's some really key issues that we have to grapple with. The issue of local authorities not being able to do what we know that they should be able to do. I know some fantastic authorities are doing great things with their county farms. Why not? Why aren't others? And the whole idea of mapping land or understanding what land could be available or what land we could access. So we've really got to get to grips with that. The issue of supply chains. We are actually doing a whole piece of work at sustainable supply chains and alternatives, as well as regulation of the current crop of retailers and huge companies. So, but building an alternative marketplace for produce from here is exciting. I know Wales has just invested in 5 hubs. The idea, we did a survey of 500 farmers and hubs for collating their produce and marking it collectively was really one of the top things farmers wanted. It was really fascinating. They also wanted to cooperate more, which, as we know, doesn't always happen. But that kind of area of thinking about the marketplace and alternative routes to market in schools or elsewhere is really exciting, as Gareth was talking about, really key. So, and I think, it's really great to hear the support from everybody for this work. We are actually very ambitious about this. We really want it to fly because we think it's got sort of win-win-wins, which actually, when you think about it, is one of its difficulties. It's like always with food. It touches on so many things that it's very difficult for people to get a handle on it. But in a way, peri-urban farming, people do sort of get it when we talk to them about it. And we had 80 people, unfortunately, they obviously didn't all make it. 80 people. We didn't actually advertise this massively. It wasn't supposed to be for the mass market public, but we still got people hearing about it. So it just shows there is interest. So we want to build the movement for peri-urban farming. So we really appreciate your comment to this initial start looking at policies. I think it's really great to keep going. I would very much look forward to the land use report from the peers, which is extremely good that you're doing.
Well, we're very nervous.
Understandable. There's nothing more crucial than land.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you, Vicky. Thank you to Stain for arranging this and for your position paper on this. I think it's really interesting and an important catalyst for action. And all the contributions, Karen and the politicians around the table, I think it's been really valuable to have this as a forum and for all the ideas that have been thrown on the table. The benefits are clear, and you've articulated that. They're substantial benefits potentially that could be unlocked through a greater use of land on the fringes of untenanted cities. Interesting, no one mentioned pollinators and the need for flowers on these areas. Because we need to do that.
There's so many things.
People don't steal flowers very often.
I would have done. I ran out of time.
But for me, one of the interesting things that's coming out of this is the ability to have the opportunity to create career interest from those who just want to do something and suddenly get sucked in, as you two both did, coming from outside of agriculture, and suddenly find this a really fascinating place. So the opportunity to expand that and to create interest for people to develop their careers through that attraction, I think is really important. That hasn't occurred to me before. On the skills front, I know Vicky's aware of this, but you are aware of the new body tier, the Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture. Horticultural element of that is really important in this respect, and we ought to be linking with tier to potentially provide specific courses for those who might want to explore at an entry level stage.
I'm one of their cultivators.
Oh, you are good man.
Yes, I know.
So we have it in there.
Brilliant.
Sorry, got again.
Derek, thank you. And I think the sort of the asks and the barriers that we need to reflect on, particularly the pressure on land use, the role of local authorities here, and how we might be able to persuade them to dedicate land, the price of land, capital, the elms scheme. I mean, what we have with elms, I think, we've inherited through from the City of Peak in terms of the 5 hectare limit. We ought to seriously take the lid off them.
Sorry, guys, I know how compelling agriculture.
Okay. Good. Anyway, thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks.